Emily had just stepped into the first-class cabin of the flight, her heart racing with excitement as she adjusted her uniform and greeted the passengers. She had been waiting for this moment all week after months of grueling shifts. Finally, a day of easy service. No delays, no complaints, just the perfect flight. It was supposed to be easy, but today was different. Today would be anything but ordinary. She moved down the aisle, her eyes scanning the plush seats, when her gaze landed on him, the elderly man sitting by the window, his grey hair neatly combed, his eyes hidden behind large glasses that seemed to make him look even more unapproachable than he probably was. Emily immediately sized him up in her mind, a typical rich old man who probably thought he was above everyone else, a man whose only concern was his comfort, no more no less. He was dressed in a simple but elegant suit that didn't scream wealth, but spoke volumes to anyone who could recognize it. The faint smile on his face looked more like a mask hiding a deeper story. Emily rolled her eyes inwardly as she walked toward him. She had seen countless passengers like him before, rich businessmen who had no respect for the crew and treated the flight as their private escape from the world. She could tell he wouldn't be any different. He probably wouldn't even acknowledge her presence, except for a quick nod when she asked if he needed anything. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I get you something to drink?" she asked politely, the smile on her face barely masking the irritation she felt from the repetitive task of offering the same drinks over and over again. The man turned his head slowly, his eyes flickering up to meet hers, but he didn't speak. He simply nodded once, not with enthusiasm, but with quiet acceptance, as if the question was beneath him. Emily frowned slightly, but quickly regained her composure, and moved on to the other passengers, who looked more eager to make small talk or order an extra glass of wine. But even as she moved down the aisle, Emily couldn't help but feel his eyes still on her, his gaze unwavering, and for a brief moment she wondered if he was studying her, if he was silently judging her. The thought unnerved her, but she quickly dismissed it as nothing more than her own insecurity and continued with her service. Throughout the rest of the cabin, Emily noticed that the elderly man didn't move much. He seemed lost in his thoughts, occasionally glancing out of the window, his face calm, serene, almost unreadable. It was a strange sight for Emily, who had grown used to seeing the more animated faces of first-class passengers who treated the flight as their personal time to shine. But there was something about him, something in his stillness, that kept Emily intrigued. He wasn't like the others. He didn't demand attention, but he held it effortlessly without even trying. And that was when she overheard it, the quiet murmurs from the flight attendants as they whispered amongst themselves about a special passenger whose identity was top secret. Emily's curiosity piqued as she eavesdropped just out of earshot. She heard the words VIP, high profile, and million-dollar deals. It was enough to make her wonder if the elderly man sitting so quietly by the window might actually be someone more important than she had given him credit for. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She kept replaying the conversation. She had overheard the words VIP and high profile echoing in her mind. What if she had misjudged the elderly man? What if he wasn't just another tired businessman lost in his own world, but someone far more significant, someone who could change everything for her? As the flight went on, Emily moved through the cabin, serving drinks, refilling glasses, smiling politely at the passengers. But her thoughts kept drifting back to him, the man by the window, who still hadn't uttered more than a few words to her. His presence felt almost ominous, like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. The more she thought about him, the more she felt a strange mix of curiosity and unease. She glanced over at him again from across the cabin, his hands folded neatly on his lap, his posture perfect, yet there was an air of quiet power surrounding him. It was in the way he carried himself, the stillness of his being, as if he didn't need to speak to command respect. Emily had seen it before in the eyes of the world's wealthiest people, but it was rare to see someone who exuded such calm authority without making a show of it. He wasn't like the others, the ones who bragged about their riches or name-dropped their latest business deals. Emily found herself moving closer to him again against her better judgment. She approached his seat tray in hand, asking if he needed anything, despite the fact that she knew he would likely turn her away with just another nod of dismissal. But this time something was different this time. When she asked if he wanted anything to drink, his eyes flickered toward her with a sharpness she hadn't noticed before. It was as if he had been waiting for this very moment, as if he had been watching her the whole time. "No, thank you." His voice was soft yet authoritative, and his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than she expected, making her feel like she was under some kind of unspoken scrutiny. Emily quickly turned and walked away, but the encounter left her with a lingering feeling something was unfolding here, something bigger than just a simple flight to a distant city. The rest of the cabin felt distant now, like the walls were closing in on her. She couldn't stop thinking about him. Who was he really? And why had he caught her attention in a way that no other passenger had ever done before? The thought of his calm gaze, the way he seemed to know exactly what was going on around him, but remained silent like a shadow, watching everything, made her skin crawl in a way that both terrified and fascinated her. As the flight neared its halfway point, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing some minor turbulence. Emily's attention was briefly diverted as the cabin shifted slightly, but when she looked back at the elderly man by the window, he was still there, still watching her, his eyes calm. But there was something more there, something that made her heart race with anticipation, as if he knew something she didn't, and he was just waiting for her to figure it out. Her hand trembled slightly as she held the drink tray. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary flight, that she was caught in something much bigger than herself. Emily couldn't stop glancing back at the elderly man every time she passed his seat. It was becoming hard to ignore him, the way he sat there like a statue, unmoving, almost otherworldly in his stillness. She had served him drinks, had exchanged a few words, yet he seemed to be paying more attention to her than she was to him. Each time their eyes met, there was a spark, a flicker of something in his gaze, something that made her feel like he knew exactly what she was thinking. It was the kind of look that made her feel exposed, vulnerable, as if she had unknowingly revealed her deepest thoughts. Without saying a word, she had worked with plenty of high-profile passengers before, but none of them made her feel this way. None of them had this effect on her. It was unsettling, and Emily hated feeling this way. She was supposed to be confident, she was supposed to be in control, yet here she was second-guessing every movement, wondering if she had somehow made a mistake. Her curiosity about him grew stronger with each passing minute. She couldn't help herself. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that there was more to this man than met the eye. It wasn't just the way he sat so quietly, or the way his eyes followed her. It was everything, the aura around him, the calmness, the secrecy, like he was hiding something. She needed to know what it was, but she wasn't sure how to find out without risking it all. As the flight stretched on, Emily tried to focus on her duties. She served drinks, she checked on the passengers, she smiled politely, but her mind kept returning to him, the man in first class, sitting silently, like he was waiting for something, waiting for her to do something. At one point she passed by his seat again. This time he wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the window, as if lost in thought. But as she walked past him, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye, a slight movement. His hand was resting on the armrest, and something glinted in the light. For a moment she couldn't make out what it was, but it looked like a watch or a piece of jewelry, something expensive and unusual. In the way it caught the light, it sent a chill down her spine, and she stopped in her tracks. Was it possible that this man wasn't just some ordinary rich guy? Had she been wrong this entire time? Was he someone important, someone powerful, someone whose presence had been overlooked by everyone around him? Her heart pounded in her chest as she fought the urge to turn around and confront him, to ask who he really was, but that would be too bold, too obvious. She couldn't risk it, not yet. Instead, she walked away, her mind racing with possibilities. Could he be someone famous, a billionaire investor, a high-profile CEO? She had heard stories about secretive moguls who travelled under the radar to avoid the public eye. But she didn't know anyone who looked like him. There was no way he could be who she thought he might be, could there? The rest of the flight dragged on as Emily wrestled with her thoughts, her nerves getting the best of her. She couldn't concentrate. She couldn't focus on anything but the man in the window seat, who continued to watch her with that same unreadable expression on his face, the man who might just be the key to something far bigger than a simple flight from point A to point B. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The weight of her curiosity felt heavier now, like a knot tightening in her chest. Every time she passed the elderly man's seat, she tried to focus on her duties. She tried to clear her mind and serve the passengers with the same politeness she always did, but it was impossible not to glance over at him every few minutes. There was something about him that gnawed at her, something she couldn't explain, but that didn't stop her from trying to make sense of it. The way he sat there so quietly was no longer calming, it was unnerving. There was an odd stillness about him, as if he were always one step ahead of everyone else. His eyes moved with a careful precision, following her every move, but never with judgment, always with an understanding that unsettled her. And then there was the glint she had noticed earlier, the flash of something expensive, something out of place. For someone who appeared to be so low-key, he didn't strike her as the type to wear extravagant jewelry or a designer watch, yet there it was, gleaming in the soft cabin light in a way that seemed almost intentional, like a subtle signal, a sign that she was missing something crucial. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was he really someone important, a businessman who preferred to keep a low profile? Or was he even more than that? Was he someone whose reputation spanned across the globe, someone whose name could change the course of her entire career if only she knew who he was? Emily had worked with celebrities and CEOs before, but none of them had this aura about them. None of them had this quiet yet unmistakable presence that made everyone around them feel like they were standing in the shadow of something much greater than themselves. She had heard whispers from other crew members about secretive passengers who wanted nothing more than to stay out of the spotlight. But they all had one thing in common: they didn't act like him. They didn't sit there with such a calm sense of control. They didn't make others feel so insignificant with nothing more than a glance. She knew she had to find out who he really was. She had to figure it out before the flight ended, before she had to go back to her routine and pretend like nothing had changed. But how could she do that? How could she get close enough to this man without crossing a line? It wasn't until much later in the flight that she got her answer in the most unexpected way. Emily had just finished serving the last round of drinks when one of her fellow attendants walked by with an urgent whisper in her ear. "You need to check the guest list." The words came so quietly, but the tone was enough to send a wave of panic through her chest. Without thinking, she rushed to the back of the cabin, where the flight attendants had access to the passenger list, and scanned the names at the top of the list. A chill ran down her spine when she saw it. There it was in bold letters, the name of a man she had heard of before, the name of someone who had made headlines more than once, the CEO of a multinational tech empire, the man who had revolutionized industries and built an empire from the ground up, the man whose reputation preceded him everywhere. He went, the man who was now sitting in first class, quietly sipping his water, as if he had never been anything more than just another passenger. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just any old businessman. This was him. This was the person she had been overlooking all along, the person she had dismissed. Without a second thought, the man she had assumed was just another rich old guy. But in truth, he was a titan of industry, a billionaire who could buy and sell entire countries with a single phone call. And just like that, everything changed. Emily stood frozen for a moment, her fingers gripping the edge of the seat as she stared at the name on the passenger list, her mind struggling to process what she had just read. The CEO of one of the world's largest tech empires was sitting in the very seat she had dismissed so casually. She had thought he was just some elderly businessman. But in reality, he was a titan, a man whose name was synonymous with power, wealth, and influence. The realization hit her like a wave, and for a moment she felt like she couldn't breathe. Her thoughts raced as she quickly glanced over at the first-class cabin, her eyes locking onto the man who was still sitting there quietly by the window, his presence more intimidating than ever now that she knew who he was. She had to fight the urge to run to the back of the plane to hide from the embarrassment of her mistake. But she couldn't do that. She had to face this. She had to confront the truth, no matter how much it terrified her. The man who had seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable, was now the center of everything, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made the worst mistake of her career. How had she been so blind? How had she not recognized him, when everyone else in the room seemed to know exactly who he was? She had worked with wealthy people before, but none of them had ever commanded this kind of quiet authority. None of them had ever made her feel so small without saying a word. As the minutes passed, Emily could feel the weight of her mistake growing heavier. She couldn't stop thinking about how he had watched her with that calm, knowing gaze, as if he had been aware of every moment of her discomfort, every time she had brushed him off without a second thought. And the worst part was she couldn't be sure whether he was angry or amused by her ignorance. Either way, she was terrified of what would happen. When the flight ended, what would he do when he realized how badly she had misjudged him? Her mind kept racing with the possibilities. Could he have overheard her complaints about him earlier when she had assumed he was just another rich jerk? Was he going to report her to the airline? Was she about to lose her job over a single moment of careless judgment? The thought of facing the consequences of her actions made her stomach twist in knots, but she couldn't change what had already happened. Just as Emily was about to gather her thoughts and figure out what to do next, she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was one of the other flight attendants, her face pale as she leaned in close. "He's asking for you," she whispered in a tone so quiet it was almost a hiss. The words sent a chill down Emily's spine, and for a moment she thought her heart might stop beating. As if in slow motion, Emily turned to face the elderly man who had now risen from his seat. He was standing just a few feet away, his posture straight and imposing, his eyes fixed on her with that same knowing look. But now there was something more, something that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't even anger. It was something far more dangerous, something that made her feel like she was standing in front of a man who had seen everything she had ever done, and was now waiting for her to understand the gravity of her mistake. Emily's heart raced as she turned to face him, the man who had been nothing but a quiet enigma up until now. But now he was standing right in front of her, and his presence felt like a storm on the horizon, something powerful, something inevitable. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, as she tried to find the words to speak, but they wouldn't come. Her mind was blank. All she could do was stare up at him and wait for him to say something, anything to break the silence that felt so heavy between them. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there looking at her with those piercing eyes that seemed to see right through her. In that moment, Emily felt smaller than she ever had in her life. She had been around influential people before. She had served CEOs and celebrities. But this was different. This wasn't just about status or wealth. This was something deeper, something that made her feel like she was standing in front of a man who could change the world with a single word. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice low and calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. "You didn't know who I was, did you?" he asked. It wasn't a question, really. It was a statement of fact, but the way he said it made her stomach drop. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She felt like she was suffocating under the weight of his gaze. Every inch of her body screamed for her to apologize for her mistake, for underestimating him, for not recognizing the power that he held. But she couldn't find the words. She couldn't find the courage to speak. He continued after a long pause, his tone never changing. "I spent my life in the shadows, not wanting attention. And I can tell you this, I've seen how people like you behave when they think they're dealing with someone beneath them." His words hit her like a slap to the face, and she flinched instinctively, but he didn't seem to care. "You thought I was just another old man who had nothing to offer, didn't you?" he went on. And Emily felt her cheeks burn with shame. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down she knew he was right. She had judged him. Before even knowing who he was, she had dismissed him as insignificant, and now she was paying the price for that mistake. For a moment there was silence again, just the sound of the plane's engines humming in the background. As Emily struggled to keep her composure, she wanted to explain herself, to beg for forgiveness. But she knew that wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't undo the damage she had done. Then, unexpectedly, he took a step back, and for the first time there was a flicker of something like amusement in his eyes, as if he found her discomfort somewhat entertaining. He didn't seem angry or vengeful. He didn't seem like the type to lash out in wrath. Instead, he seemed almost intrigued by her reaction. "I'm not going to fire you or report you," he said finally, his words hanging in the air like a lifeline. "But let me make something clear to you, Emily." He paused, looking down at her with a sharp gaze. "People like me, we notice everything we notice when you're too busy judging us to see who we really are, and that can come back to haunt you if you're not careful." Emily nodded numbly, her throat tight with emotion, as she tried to process what he was saying. The man who could have destroyed her career with a single phone call was now standing there offering her an unexpected reprieve. But she knew she couldn't take this moment for granted. She had learned a hard lesson today, a lesson she would never forget. Emily stood there, her mind racing. As the man's words echoed in her head, she couldn't believe what had just happened. She had expected anger, or worse, maybe even a cold dismissal, but instead he had shown her mercy. And now she didn't know what to feel. Part of her wanted to thank him, to apologize profusely for her mistake. But another part of her wondered why he was being so calm, so understanding. Was it possible that he wasn't as powerful as she thought? Or was this just another test, another way of him watching her every move, trying to see how she would react? She couldn't stop thinking about what he had said, how he had noticed everything, how he had seen through her judgments and assumptions, like they were nothing more than a thin veil covering up the truth. He had been right. She had assumed she knew exactly who he was based on his appearance and age, and had dismissed him without a second thought. But now she was standing in front of a man who had far more power than she could have imagined, and she had no idea what to do next. The silence between them stretched on longer than she would have liked. She could feel the tension in the air. It was thick and heavy, like the calm before a storm, and Emily wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever came next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man spoke again, his voice calm, but carrying an undertone of something more, something she couldn't quite place. "You know, Emily, I've seen a lot of people in my life, people who think they can control everything, who think they can control others. But they always forget one thing." He paused for a moment, letting the words linger in the air before continuing. "They forget that in the end, we're all human, we all make mistakes. And no matter how powerful we become, those mistakes will always be there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to remind us that we're not infallible." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. As he spoke, it was as if he was reading her thoughts, as if he knew exactly how she felt right now. She wasn't sure if she was relieved or terrified by the way he seemed to understand her so completely. It was like she had been laid bare in front of him, and there was nowhere to hide. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out for a moment. She couldn't find the right words to explain herself, to make him understand the pressure she had felt, the constant expectations to be perfect, to never show weakness. But all of that seemed so insignificant now in the face of the man standing in front of her, a man who had everything yet didn't feel the need to flaunt it, a man who had the power to crush her career without a second thought, but had chosen not to. The man looked down at her with a slight smile, as if he could sense her inner turmoil. "Don't worry, Emily, I'm not here to ruin your life or make you regret what happened today," he said gently. "But I will tell you this: you've learned an important lesson today, one that will stay with you for the rest of your life. No matter how successful you become, no matter how high you climb, never forget that every person you meet, every person you judge, has their own story, their own struggles, their own power." Emily nodded slowly, her heart still pounding in her chest, as she tried to take in the weight of his words. The lesson she had learned today wasn't just about humility. It was about seeing beyond the surface, looking deeper into the people around her, and recognizing that no one could be judged based on appearances alone. As he turned to walk back to his seat, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. She'd have been given a chance to change her perspective, to see the world differently, to realize that sometimes the greatest lessons came from the most unexpected places and the most unexpected people. And in that moment, she knew she would never forget this flight, never forget the man who had quietly taught her the importance of seeing beyond the surface. As the elderly man settled back into his seat, Emily watched him closely, her mind still buzzing with everything that had just happened. He hadn't asked for anything in return. He hadn't demanded an apology. He had simply left her with his words. And for the first time in her life, she felt a deep sense of gratitude, mixed with confusion. Why had he been so calm, so understanding, when he had every right to be angry or disappointed with her? Her mistake could have cost her everything, but instead he had chosen to teach her something far more valuable than she could have ever imagined. The flight continued on, and Emily moved through the cabin, mechanically, no longer aware of the passengers around her, her thoughts consumed by the man in first class, the man who had shown her what it truly meant to see the world through a different lens. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been given a rare opportunity to change her life, and it was up to her to make it count. As the plane descended, and the captain's voice filled the cabin announcing their descent, Emily stood at the front of the plane, looking out of the small window, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. She had learned so much in the last few hours. But the most important lesson wasn't about who the man was or what he could do for her. It was about how she had treated others, how she had been so quick to judge, so quick to assume, based on appearances alone, and how that had led her to almost make the biggest mistake of her life. The plane touched down with a smooth bump, and as the passengers began to prepare for arrival, Emily glanced once more at the man in first class. He was gathering his things, preparing to leave, as if nothing had happened, as if this encounter had been nothing more than a passing moment in a much larger story that no one else would ever understand. As the passengers filed out of the plane, Emily couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. What would her life look like after today? How would she move forward, knowing what she knew now? Would she be able to carry the lesson with her? Would she let it change her? Or would she go back to being the person she had been before? Just as she finished gathering her thoughts, the elderly man stood up and began to walk toward the exit. Emily moved aside to let him pass. But before he did, he paused for a moment and turned toward her. There was a slight smile on his face, something almost imperceptible. But it was there, and in that smile, Emily saw something that she hadn't seen before, something that made her realize he hadn't just taught her a lesson about humility. He had taught her something deeper, something about power and kindness, and how the two could coexist in ways that most people never realized. He looked at her one last time and said quietly, "Remember, Emily, the most important thing in life isn't the money or the success. It's the way you treat others, because in the end, that's all that matters." And with that, he walked away, leaving Emily standing there with a heart full of gratitude and a new understanding of what it truly meant to see the world beyond the surface.